hello and a very warm welcome to Dateline London. I'm Kasia Madeira. It's very good of you to be with us today. This week, we're discussing the US Supreme Court overturning a 50-year-old ruling that legalised abortion nationwide and look at its implication for millions of American women. We'll also be discussing the aftermath of the recent by-elections here in the UK, and we'll be asking what the losses for the Conservative Party mean for the future of Boris Johnson and his government. And we're also going to investigate allegations that Russia is deporting captured Ukrainians, including children. Today for Dateline London, we're joined by the UK's veteran political commentator Steve Richards. Also joining us, Ned Tamko from the Christian Science Monitor. And we welcome Vera Kuchevskaya, the founder of Moscow's TV channel Rain TV that is actually banned by President Putin. Welcome to you all. It's really great to have you all here. So we're going to start with the US Supreme Court. It's voted to overturn the landmark ruling that legalised abortion almost 50 years ago. It struck down the Roe versus Wade decision weeks after a leaked document suggested that it favoured doing so. Now, this decision paves the way for half the country to severely restrict or completely ban termination. We're saying the draft was leaked. We're not really surprised, but as your publication, as the Christian Science Monitor has said,
yeah, it's almost impossible to overstate the significance of this. And there have been periods of judicial activism by the Supreme Court in the past, most famously in the late 1950s, 1960s, 1970s over civil rights legislation. But the difference was that that was explicitly extending a right or a series of rights that were at the core of the American project of the Constitution, and that is equality under the law, equal access, equal treatment. This is the first time that the Supreme Court, for political reasons, because of the changes, because whole generations of American women, and this is not a partisan issue if you're a young woman seeing all of a sudden a basic right, or what you assume to be a basic right, taken away by the Supreme Court. I think there will be repercussions, and potentially even repercussions in the form of a backlash at the polls for some of the ultra-conservative Republicans who have for years been militating for exactly this change.
Repercussions, and also we've been hearing President Biden came out pretty quickly to talk about this, and he sounded upset, he sounded angry and very emotive when it comes to this. He was talking about this idea of helping women reach the states, travel to states where they can potentially access those states that aren't, as you were saying, going to implement these trigger laws, to get access. But it's not as easy as that, is it?
No, I thought it was an impressive response, and because the anger was genuine, it sort of energised him. But I found it so interesting to watch an energised president, the supposedly mighty president of the United States, utterly impotent to do anything about what Ned has sort of suggested is a kind of revolution taking place in the United States. And, you know, I know the United States Constitution is this glorious kind of apparently elegant mix of checks and balances and power and so on. But I sometimes think it is all over the place. So this is Donald Trump's Supreme Court, in effect, rendering the new president unable to do anything about this extraordinary change. So that's really just watching it, from a distance. It is so interesting. You're right, the practical measures. Well, there are states where abortion will still be available, so maybe some can go there. But as Biden mentioned, there will be many poor people who will be affected by this, and maybe they won't have the time, the money to get to other states. And so this is going, my favourite word in politics is consequences. The consequences of this are many and deep.
the consequences, and we will reach those in a moment. And Ned, I'm going to come back to you on that. But Vera, when it comes to when we witness, say in Eastern Europe, when we witness the kind of protests against changes in abortion rights in Poland, for example, you and I, we were talking earlier, we both witnessed the tens of thousands of women going out on the streets in Warsaw and lots of different towns and cities across Poland. It's fascinating to see it from that kind of perspective as to what is happening in such an influential country in the United States.
It's speechless for me. And today I felt that I'm kind of second-class citizen, because I feel so, because my rights, not mine, because I'm not American, but women's rights were taken. So, it's nonsense, speechless, absurd.
And when we talk about the consequences, and I think a lot of people are making their feelings very, very vocal, and many women saying similar to what you just said, Vera. Lots of people, of course, not as well. A lot of people have been campaigning for a long time for this, Ned, and that has to also be understood.
Yeah, this was not an accident, and indeed, one of the frustrations for those who wanted to defend Roe versus Wade was, to put it mildly, an element of subterfuge involved in the congressional part of the path that got us here, in that when President Obama had a vacancy to fill on the Supreme Court in the final year of his administration, the then Republican-run Senate refused to even consider his nominee. Then very, very near the end of the Trump administration, they fast-tracked a nominee for Trump. So in effect, as Steve said, Trump has 3 nominees on this court, fulfilling a long, explicit aim for leaders on the right of the Republican Party to get rid of Roe versus Wade. And what the long-term consequences are is hard to tell, but I think one thing that bears watching is that one of Trump's vulnerabilities at the polls turned out to be suburban Republican women who are traditionally rock solid, or many of them have been Republican Party supporters, who were so alienated by his behavior, by what he did. This is a real, and Vera, you touched on this, and this is a unifying cause which touches women voters, whether you're young, old, Republican, Democrat, and I think it may be a question of be careful what you wish for if you're on the right of the Republican Party, have been trying for a long time. It's not clear to me that there won't be a backlash.
But it was interesting when we talk about the powerlessness of the president to do anything about it. There is actually something that he can do, but we were discussing a little bit earlier, he's not going to do it.
The Supreme Court. That would be a very risky thing to do, because it would end up a bit like the House of Lords here. The Supreme Court, every time a new president comes in, that packing would continue and become absurd. So apparently that is the only mechanism, and it's not going to be deployed. It is very interesting, though, hearing Ned talking about what happens when the evangelical right, who have been campaigning, wins. I mean, British politics is bonkers at the moment, but
your words.
My words. But even the sort of evangelical dimension, British politics is pretty secular. So it's very interesting when you have this victory. Now, I find from my experience of politics that some of those who just love campaigning, going to meetings, getting very angry, when they actually win, run a mile. Now, let's see what happens. I mean, maybe they're all feeling euphoric at the moment. But when stories emerge of, as President Biden said in his response, what happens if someone's a victim of incest and so on. Now, these stories are vivid if they emerge. And that is when I think the backlash could be wider than some of those who've been campaigning for this had contemplated while they were enjoying the anger and passion of the campaign.
And we'll see that backlash, and as Ned was saying, the consequences. But Vera, just a final thought on this particular subject from you when it comes to what Russia is looking at when they're looking at monitoring what is happening in the US is how do you think this is going to be relayed back to the Russian people, this decision that is so polarizing in that country?
I think, I'm guessing now, but I think propaganda would use it against the states, obviously. And at the same time, it's quite a tricky one because Russia is driving to very conservative society. And we heard such voices from church last years, but but I would rather propaganda would use it to show, look, this is the States. Come on.
Divisions within that country. Absolutely. Okay, well, thank you very much. We're going to cross over the pond now and we're going to focus on the UK because Boris Johnson's government lost 2 by-elections this week. They're like buses. Is this a case of midterm blues or is there something more fundamental going on? Steve, look, you watch this closely. What are we to make of it? Are we really meant to read something in? They are by-elections after all.
Yeah, but by-elections can be significant. Some aren't. It depends on the context in which they take place. And remember, the 2 by-elections, one in a seat in the southwest of England, another in a sort of previously Labour-held territory, which Boris Johnson won in December 2019. To lose both, following a vote of confidence from your own MPs earlier in the same month, this month, where he kind of struggled on, but not with a great triumphant win in that vote, means inevitably it's going to fuel further speculation about his leadership. And we've had already a former Conservative leader, Michael Howard, who does this very cautiously when he speaks out, saying he should resign, joining those who've already called on that to happen, a growing number of Tory backbenchers.
And you've also had his co-chairman quit as well. When
his party chairman. In a way, that's the most significant thing that's happened, because when prime ministers fall, it tends to be, and it hardly ever happens outside elections, but when it does, it's when the cabinet turns. Now, there's absolutely no sign that anyone else is going to follow yet. It's a weak and timid cabinet, dependent on Boris Johnson's patronage. But the chairman went in the early hours of the morning after the by-election with a very scathing letter. So that fuels the turbulence. The big question remains, what is the trigger to remove him? He won't go voluntarily. That's the only certainty in the current situation. But the other certainty is now it will trigger a summer of turmoil for him.
A summer of turmoil. Ned, when it comes to what is happening in the minutiae detail, I wonder how much interest for your publication, international publication, are you looking at these details or are you looking at the bigger picture? Say, Boris Johnson, this is happening in the UK, but he at the moment, he's visiting Rwanda, he's going to be in Germany for the G7, he'll be in Spain for NATO. What's the perspective that you're taking?
Political high drama always makes good copy, and Boris, whatever his other faults, is always an entertainer as a politician, not always for the right reasons. It's a little the mirror image of how the rest of the world couldn't take its eyes off Donald Trump during the Trump administration.
Well, he's as much watched.
Well, he's only for just curiosity value, but obviously this is a close ally. It's a democracy. It's the mother of democracies, mother of parliaments. So this is of interest. The only thing I would add to what Steve said is the other side of the equation, and that is labor. It's clear the Tories are in deep trouble, but I'd be curious to see whether Steve agrees. My sense is we're not quite yet at what might be called a Tony Blair New Labour moment. And for those of you who are lucky enough to be young enough not to remember Tony Blair or New Labour, in the 1990s...
I think we're all at that age, so we remember.
In the 1990s, by the time of the election, you had a tired Conservative government, you had internal differences within the Conservative Party, they'd been in power for 18 years, the road was up, very much the way we feel, or some people feel about the current Conservative government. But you also had a kind of sense of almost inevitability that this, and we forget, this young, bright, articulate, well-prepared alternative government was waiting in the wings. And then you had a sense of a tide turning, and I don't get that sense quite yet with the current Labour Party and Keir Starmer.
You don't get that with Sir Keir Starmer.
Now,
Vera,
it may change, but I don't get that sense yet.
Is it something that you think we're on the cusp of change in this country, or not really?
Right now, I'm a wrong person to answer, to comment this, because I follow Ukrainian perspectives. You know that Boris Johnson is a hero, #1 in Ukraine now. And everything he does towards Ukraine, you know, it triggers completely different feelings and emotions. So that's why I'm a wrong person, because each time he stand next to Mr. Zelensky made him even kind of bigger.
Well, he popped up in Kyiv, didn't he? We were expecting him somewhere else in the UK, and actually he popped up. Okay, we will talk about Ukraine in just a moment, of course, but just going back to what Ned was saying, Steve, so change, what do you reckon?
Well, there are different forms of change. There is a tide against this government. There's enough evidence of that. And remember, it's been in power for 12 years. This is its 4th term, and we'll be looking for a 5th. But Ned's right. There isn't the same tidal shift towards Labour that there was in the build-up to 97. But you wrongly call me a veteran. I'm still rocking and very young. But I have to say, I'm told that there are many times in British politics where it's like this, that there isn't an obvious enthusiasm for one party or the other. And it might be that Britain is staggering towards a hung parliament. But if that is the case, there will be a Labour government, because the smaller parties would back a change of government and not give this lot another term. So it might be a more clumsy, less tangible tidal wave than 1997 under Tony Blair, but I feel there is a shift. What do you mean? I feel that they've just lost 2 by-elections.
But the last time that happened, the government, and the date's just gone from my head, but the then government went on to win the election.
Well, it has varied. In 2010, there was a coalition. Sometimes there's a minority. In the 70s, which is quite similar to now in some respects, there was a minority government, Labour government, which staggered on for quite a few years. So it doesn't always mean when one party is in trouble, there's going to be a landslide for the other. Okay. So we might be in that sort of terrain.
Well, we watch and wait, but we do move on. And yes, we're all veterans here. Let's all be honest about it. Well, young at heart, young at heart. Now, as Vera has already mentioned, Russia's attack on Ukraine grinds on, and a very disturbing development emerging from this war is the huge displacement of people and also the allegations of deportations of hundreds of civilians and prisoners of war to remote parts of Russia. So, Vera, let's just focus in on what the allegations are here when it comes to people forcibly taken to Russia.
So first of all, there are 2 different groups of people. First of all, it's prisoners of war. It is one group of people, and this group of people, POWs, they're placed in prison that was previously cleared for them, or special pre-trial detention center in mostly in south of Russia, and we do not have information what is going on there. I saw many leaked videos and photos from such centers, prisons, but every footage we have to verify. But what I saw a group of people with masks on their eyes, walking with guards or sitting. But again, I cannot verify these photos. And another group of people, the problem is all these centers are run by FSB. I don't know even single state report, a propaganda representative who was there, who filmed there inside these centers. Propaganda released several clips with Ukrainian war prisoners. They were nice and tidy, they were reading books, watching TV, but it is part of Russian metaverse. It's a show business, that's not a journalism, so it's a stage story. Another group of people, it's based on official Russian figures that was released a week ago. It was 1,400,000 people who were the refugee amount in Russia. Those people, most of them, they had no choice to go to their Western countries, to come back to another parts of Ukraine, or to go to Russia. They didn't have choice. Many people, many sources, right now, many refugees managed to cross the border in Estonia with the help of independent volunteers in Russia, especially in St. Petersburg. They help people to cross the border in Estonia, and all these people are our trusted sources now, because they give an interview, they tell their story, how they cross Russian-Ukrainian border, how they spend weeks in filtration camp, how they were interrogated, and etc., how they were searched. And
it's those testimonies, those early testimonies, that are really crucial to gather those testimonies. The FSB, the Russian Federation's Federal Security Service, but it's also the Supreme Council of Ukraine, the commissioner for there, the Commissioner of Human Rights, Lyudmila Denisova, who gave those numbers that you were saying, Vera, 1.3 million Ukrainians, including over 200,000 children that Ms. Denisova was saying are forcibly deported. And Ned, and Vera, thank you for stressing that some of this is not verified, and it's really important to stress that, but it just adds to the devastating news that we're hearing, to the brutality of the conflict that we're seeing, to the enormous displacement that we're witnessing.
And add to that the fact that there's no end in sight, and that this seems to be dragging on. And Vera mentioned Boris Johnson. One of the reasons he's so popular in Ukraine is that he is one of the few, or one of the leading Western figures who has been pressing for the West to keep paying attention. And it's hard to escape the notion that for Putin, he's hoping that kind of time is on his side. That basically, if this drags on for a long time, will the West's attention span wane? Will the fact that economic problems are mounting, that winter is coming, that it's harder to keep kind of a coalition together for months on end, will that cause Western unity and effectiveness to flag? And if that happens, one can only assume there will be many, many more people spirited out of Ukraine and into parts of Russia.
Because exactly as Ned picked up, but Boris Johnson, and Steve, you've got literally a sentence to talk about this, but Boris Johnson described the concerns about fatigue when it comes to this war.
Yeah, and it will be reflected not just in leaders, but in voters, worried about the impact on energy prices, food prices, and the longer it goes on, the more that word fatigue could turn into something else altogether, an intolerance of the consequences, to use that word again. So a long, drawn-out war of attrition will test not only the will of leaders, but voters too.
And in the meantime, it's the civilians, it's the people on the ground, the millions of people that have been displaced. And Vera, I was at the start of the war on the border between Poland and Ukraine, witnessed at that point, hundreds of thousands, now, as we know, millions of people who have had to flee Ukraine. As usual, we are out of time. There is so much to discuss, but we are out of time. But I would like to say a big, big thank you, Vera. It's really great to have you back on. Steve as well, thank you for sharing your contributions. And Ned as well, on such a historic day for the United States. So thank you very much for sharing all your views. To all of our panellists, a big, big thank you, and a very big thank you for watching at home. Do join us again, same time next week. But for the time being, from me and the Dateline team, it is goodbye.